Yikes. Two prominent Republican 2020 election deniers, Congressman Jim Jordan and ex-RNC chairwoman Ronna McDaniel, were each humiliated in back-to-back interviews when that topic came up. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bell before you go. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, friends, this was serendipity or divine providence or something, because we're talking about two very different Republicans that have one thread of commonality, which is that they aggressively peddled the 2020 election lies from Donald Trump since the 2020 election, did everything in their power to steal a free and fair election from President Biden. And they both, in the span of like 24 to 48 hours, they sat down for interviews on two different networks with two very different interviewers. And when the topic of the 2020 election came up, both of them publicly disgraced themselves, and it was so fun to unpack. We're going to start with Congressman Jim Jordan, who is the more prominent of the two. He recently sat down with Leslie Stahl of 60 Minutes, allegedly to talk about, or ostensibly to talk about, I should say, quote unquote, censorship by private media. And Leslie Stahl hit him with an interesting question, and you just watch Jim Jordan visibly crumble. It's so fun, especially for a guy who doesn't spend his time legislating. Just for the record, Jim Jordan is the least productive congressman in the Republican Party, and I think in all of Congress. He spends all of his time pontificating and, waging culture wars. So you would think he would do better than what he's about to do here, but he just face plants, and it's so good.
Congressman Jordan argues that the tech companies shouldn't remove most of what they call misinformation.
I think you let the American people respect the American people, their common sense, to figure out what's accurate, what isn't.
Well, what about this idea that the 2020 election was stolen? You think that these companies should allow people to say that, and individuals can make up their own mind, and that there should be...
I think the American people are smart. Look, I've not said that. What I've said is there were concerns about the 2020 election. I think Americans agree with that.
No, they don't.
You don't think there were concerns with the 2020 election?
Most people don't question the result. That's all I'm saying. They don't question whether Biden won or not. Right? Right. Most people don't question the outcome.
Right.
You could tell he really didn't want to answer that question. Perhaps he couldn't even fathom it. Wait, what? I'm sorry? Most people don't question the result of the election. They don't. A disturbing number do, but it's not half, certainly not a majority. We'll get into that at the end. But again, this is Leslie Stahl just putting it so bluntly. Do you? Do they? Do you? And watching him crumble in the face of such a very clear question, which, by the way, has a factual answer. Donald Trump has been spending much of the campaign saying a majority of Americans question the election. That's not true. And so Jim Jordan just contradicted Donald Trump in real time on 60 Minutes, and it's glorious. But as a reminder, before we play the clips of Ronna McDaniel, Jim Jordan was involved in Donald Trump's schemes to overturn the 2020 election. And in fact, there's evidence that Trump and Jordan were in close contact as Trump was trying to steal the election from President Biden. And there's evidence to suggest that Jim Jordan and Donald Trump spoke on the phone during January 6th prior to the insurrection. And this has produced a number of iconic Jim Jordan crumbling moments. And I want to just remind you of one in which he was on the Fox Propaganda Network, a sympathetic network. But even the Fox host was like, hey, out of curiosity, did you talk to Donald Trump during January 6th? And watch Jim Jordan bend over backwards to try to avoid answering that straightforward question.
Committee is obviously going to go down a number of different roads about who knew what when, who was talking to coordinators of the protest. Did you talk to the former president that day?
I've talked to the former president umpteen times, thousands. I mean, not thousands times, but countless times. I talked to the president. I never talk about what we talk about because I just don't think that's appropriate. Just like I don't talk about what happens in Republican conferences. So I've talked to the president numerous times. I continue to talk to the president since he's left office.
On January 6th, Congressman.
Yes, I mean, I've talked to the president. I've talked to the president so many. I can't remember all the days I've talked to him, but I've certainly talked to the president.
Yeah, and on that day can you share any of the insight of what he was thinking about that day?
Brett, the people we need to come testify are the people who can testify to the fundamental questions. Why didn't the United States Capitol, the People's House, have an appropriate security posture on that day? And what have we done? Those are the people we need to hear from. Yeah. That's the information and testimony we need to get. That's what we should focus on. But I don't think that Benny Thompson, the chairman of this committee, said everything's on the.
So we could keep going on, but it's just so funny that, again, he's like, yeah, I talk to Donald Trump all the time. I mean, my God, just a gazillion times. What about January 6th? Yes, of course I've talked to Donald Trump a gazillion times. Yeah, I know, I understand that. But what about the 6th? You can tell he wanted to do everything in his power to avoid answering the question because he was terrified at the time that the House January 6th Select Committee would investigate him. By the way, he was issued a subpoena, did not comply with it. And he's probably worried that the Department of Justice and Jack Smith's investigation may end up involving him as well. I don't know if that's true, but the sheer nervousness of Jim Jordan is just so delightful. Now, with that in mind, we're going to switch gears to a different Republican. This is Ronna McDaniel. She was not a member of Congress. She was the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee. So she played a very powerful role, a prominent role in allegedly funding and orchestrating the election and re-election of prominent Republicans. She was recently kicked out of her role after, months and months and months of criticism and election cycle after election cycle of defeat after defeat. And she was replaced in part by Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, right? Just further cementing how much of a cult the Republican Party has become. But again, as a reminder, Ronna McDaniel, 4 years, has peddled Donald Trump's big lie. That's the context for this. And she sat down for an interview on Meet the Press because, stupidly, NBC has hired Ronna McDaniel to serve as a political analyst, despite, I mean, they're free to, hire conservatives and even Republicans. That's fine. But she was a prominent election denier who helped seriously damage the civic fabric of the United States. She sat down for an NBC interview with Meet the Press, her current employers, and it did not go well for her when this topic came up.
Stop you because you just said Joe Biden's a legitimately elected president. This is the first time you have said this.
It's not. I have said it many times.
Well, this is what you said a year ago to Chris Wallace. I want to play you what you said.
Are you saying, as the chair of the Republican Party, that you still have questions as to whether or not Joe Biden was the duly elected president?
Joe Biden's the president.
No, I didn't ask you whether he's the president.
No, I don't think that. I think there were lots of problems.
He won the election?
I think there were lots of problems with 2020.
Do you think
he won the election?
Pardon?
But ultimately, he won the election. But there were lots of problems with the 2020 election. 100%.
And that's fair.
But I don't think he won it fair. I don't. I'm not going to say that.
So you didn't say he won it fair at that point. Can you say, as you sit here today, did Joe Biden win the election fair and square?
He won. He's the legitimate
Did he win
president.
Fair and square?
Fair and square, he won. It's certified. It's done. But I
Ronna,
do think, Kristen, let me just say something.
To say that. Why has it taken you until now to be able to say that?
I'm going to push back a little because I do think it's fair to say there were problems in 2020. And to say that does not mean he's not the legitimate
president. But Ronna, when you say that, it suggests that there was something wrong with the election. And you know that the election was the most heavily scrutinized. Chris Krebs said it was the most secure election in modern history. When you say there were problems, it suggests still that you're giving credence to these allegations of fraud.
You have states like Pennsylvania go from 260,000 mail ballots in 2016 to 2.6 million, saying, you know what, when you get rid of ID for all mail-in ballots, that's a concern. We should all be concerned about the care, custody, integrity of every ballot. But that's all I'm saying. And you know what? This is a viewpoint of a lot of Republicans, and they think Joe Biden's the president, but they also think there were problems.
The reason that so many Republicans believe this crap is because of people like Jim Jordan and Ronna McDaniel. They poison the well. They ask questions and call into question the veracity of an election. Then others pick it up, and then they go back and say, see, there are questions. Well, you were the ones who initially asked the questions without basis and kind of allowed this thing to promulgate. Then you acknowledge its existence and use it to legitimize your views. It's just a complete self-serving cycle that Republicans have engaged in, and McDaniel played a role in it. This interview, by the way, from Kristen Welker was a masterclass, and this is Kristen Welker has been at best an inconsistent interviewer. She has given entirely too much birth to MAGA and to Trump in the past, but this is how you interview somebody, because now Ronna McDaniel is saying, yeah, Joe Biden won fair and square, but that's the exact opposite of what you were saying as the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee. And I would argue even in that position, or perhaps especially in that position, you have an obligation to tell people the truth and to encourage and to use your power to force your candidates to tell the truth. And Ronna McDaniel did the exact opposite. I'll also say as a reminder, too, that we covered this in a previous video last year, there is bombshell reporting coming from the Detroit News that in 2020, Ronna McDaniel and then President Trump got on the phone with 2 local election officials in Michigan to try to get them to not certify President Biden's win. They had the recording of it. So again, these aren't people who've merely flirted with the notion that there may be some questions about the election. These are people who were at the forefront of the 2020 election big lie. They actively helped Donald Trump along the way. And to watch them disintegrate in back-to-back interviews on this topic is just glorious. The last thing I'll say is with respect to the perception. Again, Trump and others say a majority of Americans think the election was stolen. It's not true. Dave McLennan, this is a fact check from WRAL News. Dave McLennan, director of Meredith Poll at Meredith College in Raleigh, Durham, says that although several polls asked respondents whether the 2020 election was fair and legitimate, none of them show that a majority of Americans think the contest was fraudulent, much less 82%. Even if you look at Republicans, the percentage that claim that the election was stolen is not as high as Trump claims. And that's for Republicans, let alone the whole country. And they go and they show poll after poll after poll. The most recent one, major one being from UMass Amherst back in January, found that 30% of respondents believe that Biden's win was illegitimate. So 70% believe that President Biden is the free and fair and legitimate president of the United States. Again, the fact that 30% of the American people question it is absurd, and Ronna McDaniel and Jim Jordan are partially to blame for it. But Leslie Stahl is right. The vast majority of Americans do not question the outcome of the 2020 election. Then the question becomes, in the 2024 election, if Republicans lose, will they also question the legitimacy of this election? And I think the answer is yes. But let me know what you think in the comments.